Welcome back to a brand new explainer. Today, we're taking a little time travel trip to examine how a single ancient piece of technology completely rewired human civilization. I mean, we spent millions of years evolving, migrating, and hunting, right? But then, around 4000 BCE, humanity made this massive pivot, and it's a pivot that completely changed our biology, our societies, and honestly, our future forever.
Okay, so let's dive into this by totally challenging everything we thought we knew about the triumph of early human progress. We almost always think of civilization as this straight, upward line of constant improvement. But what if the very invention that allowed us to build cities and empires actually came with a hidden, devastating cost? Like what if, in our desperate quest for stability, we actually ended up building our own cage? Part 1. The First Harvest. We're heading to Mesopotamia, right around 4000 BCE. To really understand this, we have to begin in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerian city of Uruk. Instead of just relying on hunting and gathering like all our ancestors did, the citizens of Uruk developed a way to actually harvest cereal grains like wheat and barley. But here's the catch. Turning those raw grains into edible food took a tremendous amount of work. In the beginning, they had to use this brand new invention called a hand mill. This wasn't easy. It was a complex, absolutely strenuous process where grains were painstakingly crushed between two heavy stones. So we were no longer just picking berries. We were using human ingenuity to manufacture our own food source. And hey, it worked. At least numerically anyway. This agricultural engine allowed Uruk to prosper and just boom into this thriving metropolis of over 50,000 residents. Section 2. The biological toll. This is where we start to see a totally unexpected cost.
Now, you'd probably think a massive boom in food production would make us stronger and healthier, right? Well, think about this stark contrast. We tend to have this highly romanticized idea of early farming, idyllic pastures, bountiful harvests, but the historical record is actually incredibly grim. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors were essentially super athletes of the past, robust and incredibly highly adapted to their environments. But as we shifted to a diet heavily reliant on cereal grains and took on the backbreaking, super repetitive labor of the hand mill and the plow, we physically changed. The citizens of Uruk literally became smaller, less noticeable farmers. Humanity was physically shrinking. And for the very first time, we became permanently landlocked to the fields we had to tend.
5'3". That is the dramatic drop in the average height of men, falling all the way from 5'9" during our hunter-gatherer days. And women shrink as well, dropping on average from 5'3" down to 5 feet flat. This single number represents just an immense biological toll extracted by this new agricultural diet and the relentless manual labor that came with it. Moving on to Section 3, the farming social pyramid. This is agriculture's trap.
So this physical and biological trap quickly evolved into a rigid societal trap. And we see this across completely different continents. Whether you were looking at the Great Pyramids of ancient Egypt or the massive, expansive Zhou dynasty in China, the agricultural engine demanded one thing above all else: a massive, immobile base of peasants at the absolute bottom to do all the manual labor. In Egypt, they farmed day in and day out, and then, when the season ended, they were put to work building monuments for the pharaoh. In China, peasants were literally tied to the land to produce crops for the lords and the king. The wealth flowed entirely to the top, while the backbreaking work was just entirely shouldered by the masses at the base. Bottom line, agriculture absolutely necessitated social inequality.
Let's ground this massive macro trend in a really fascinating micro-narrative. Over in China, around 2100 BCE, the reliance on agriculture was absolute. But massive floods from the Yellow River would just repeatedly destroy the wheat and barley, causing immense, devastating famine. Legend tells us that a man named Yu the Great spent 13 relentless years building levees and dikes to divert the rivers and save the farmland. His success brought immense joy, and he was basically hailed as a savior. This desperate need to protect agricultural land birthed the Xia dynasty, which is the very first Chinese dynasty, and cemented the precedent that absolute power follows merit. Protecting the crops literally created the concept of an emperor.
But this brings up a burning question that I really want you to think about for a second. Why would anyone just settle for this? If you're a peasant in ancient Egypt or Zhou dynasty China, physically shrinking, working from dawn to dusk, giving your crops up to a king, why not just walk away? How on earth did ancient empires keep the masses from simply abandoning the fields? Well, that brings us to Section 4, Philosophy for the Peasant and Maintaining Social Order.
See, feeding an empire made farming a biological necessity, sure, but it was philosophy that actually kept the social order intact. To see how this worked, let's take a look at Eastern philosophy, which emerged towards the end of the Zhao dynasty. Confucius created a philosophical framework focused heavily on respect, loyalty, and responsibility. A really central concept of this is Li. Li refers to the formal and informal social conventions that maintain order and harmony. By deeply ingraining these customs into society, Confucianism provided a formal framework that encouraged absolute loyalty to those above you. This effectively kept the farmers at the bottom of the pyramid content with their heavy burdens, all for the sake of societal harmony. And it wasn't just Confucianism doing this work. Lao Tzu introduced Taoism, which teaches individuals to basically align with the natural flow of the universe, rather than fighting against it. The core message for the common everyday person: live peacefully, don't worry about external political things that are completely outside of your control, and just focus purely on your farming. It acted as this brilliant philosophical coping mechanism, making a super grueling life bearable and keeping the peasants working the land without ever questioning the kings and lords who are reaping all the benefits above them. Which leads us to Section 5, the hunger for expansion and geopolitical wars.
So we've seen how agriculture trapped us biologically and socially. Now we see how it forced aggressive geopolitical expansion. Just look at this fascinating chain of events starting around 800 BCE over in ancient Greece. As their city-states grew, the Greeks realized a terrifying truth. The land they occupied was practically infertile. To produce their most essential staple, grain, they desperately needed to import it. This absolute reliance on an agricultural food source they couldn't even grow at home forced them to aggressively colonize the surrounding world. It's crazy to think about, but the early roots of European colonization weren't necessarily driven by some greedy desire for gold, but by a desperate existential hunger for imported grain.
90. That is a massive number. That is how many colonies were built by just one single Greek city-state, Miletus. At its absolute height, Miletus set up colonies spanning all the way from modern-day Marseille in France to Rostov-on-Don over in Russia. They spread across entire continents, waging wars and displacing populations, all simply to secure enough agricultural land to produce food for their people back home. And that really brings us to the core thesis of this whole explainer. Listen to this quote from our source material. People became landlocked, changing the very essence of what it means to be human. While we love to celebrate the human ingenuity it took to harvest cereal grains and build those complex handmills, the harsh reality is that the grains ultimately mastered us. They tied us to the land, they literally shrank our bodies, they created rigid social hierarchies, and they fueled endless wars for expansion. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If the ancient technology of agriculture completely rewired our biology, created massive social inequality, and dictated the rise and fall of entire empires, what on earth is modern technology doing to us right now? Are our screens, our algorithms, and all our new tools actually liberating us? Or are they quietly building a brand new kind of trap? Definitely think about that as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.